Imagine being the kind of soul who gives without calculation, who loves without conditions, who stays when others walk away. You didn't just open your heart to them, you handed it over, trusting that they would hold it gently. But instead of care, they gave you cruelty. Instead of warmth, they brought cold silence. And what hurts the most is not just the betrayal, but the way they made a game out of your emotions. Turning your trust into their amusement, they laughed while you wept. They stayed silent while you begged for answers. They disappeared when you needed them the most. And the worst part, they knew what they were doing. This wasn't ignorance, it wasn't immaturity, it was a deliberate manipulation. Like a puppeteer pulling the strings, they watched you fall deeper into confusion, thinking something was wrong with you, when in reality, they were the ones wearing a mask. There is a special kind of pain that comes from realizing you were entertainment in someone else's emotional theater, that your vulnerability was seen not as beauty, but as a target, that your loyalty was not cherished, but mocked in secret. They played hot and cold. They gave you glimpses of hope and then snatched it away like it meant nothing. And each time they left, they made you question your worth, while they sat in the shadows, watching your heart break, unmoved. You told yourself stories to survive. You said, maybe they're confused, maybe they're just hurt, maybe if I love harder they'll change. But what if the truth is far simpler and far more heartbreaking? What if they knew exactly what they were doing all along? What if your pain was part of their plan? God sees that. You see, there's a divine record being kept, not on paper, not in ink, but in truth. Every act of deception, every silent abandonment, every manipulative smile, it is all known. You may have cried yourself to sleep thinking no one noticed the storm inside you, but heaven did. God saw every tear that slid down your cheek. He heard the silent prayers you whispered at night, asking why someone who said they cared could be so cruel. And more than that, he understood the pain of being mocked while loving sincerely. God does not look away from the games people play with others' hearts. He doesn't shrug off betrayal like the world does. Where man may excuse manipulation as just how people are, God calls it out for what it is: wickedness. Emotional cruelty disguised as charm, a performance where one person suffers while the other feeds their pride. So let me tell you something holy and terrifying. God will not be mocked, and neither will your pain. What they called just fun will become the very thing they can't run from. What they did in secret, God will drag into the light. And what they destroyed for sport, God will restore. Not just in you, but in a way that humbles them completely, not out of spite, but out of divine justice. Because when someone plays games with your heart, they are not just wounding you, they are offending the one who created that heart. And the one who created you does not sleep. He does not forget, and he does not allow cruelty to go unanswered forever. They may walk confidently now, thinking they got away with it. They may still post smiles, pretending everything's fine, but they are not at peace. Because you can't toy with God's child and expect favor to follow you. You can't fake affection, use someone's deepest love against them, and walk away untouched. In your stillness, God is moving. In your silence, he is writing a new story. And in the ruins they left behind, he is laying a new foundation. So don't curse them. Don't chase answers they'll never give. Don't waste another tear hoping they'll wake up and realize what they did. Let God deal with the ones who play games with your heart, because he will. In a way more just, more powerful, and more healing than anything you could imagine. Your pain is not forgotten. Your worth was never lost. and your healing is already underway. They wore love like a costume, while hiding cruelty underneath. There is something particularly shattering about betrayal that comes dressed in kindness. It's one thing to be hurt by an enemy. It is another thing entirely to be wounded by someone who held your hand while they twisted the knife. They didn't begin with cruelty. No, that would have been too obvious. They wore love like a costume, a carefully crafted disguise, stitched together with just enough attention, just enough affection, just enough presence to make you believe it was real. But it wasn't. Behind every smile was calculation. Behind every embrace a hidden agenda. You mistook their charm for care, their attention for affection, and their words for truth. And how could you not? They mirrored your needs back at you. They studied your soul like a script, only to perform a role that suited them. They knew how to enter your life through the door labeled intimacy, and once inside, they turned your vulnerability into their playground. They didn't just deceive you, they studied you. They watched how you responded when you felt appreciated. They noted how your eyes lit up at small gestures. They understood what you longed to hear and said it with precision. But it was all part of the act. Their intentions were never love, only control, only dominance, only ego. What makes it so painful is that you responded to what they pretended to be. You gave them your heart because they made you believe it was safe to do so. You let your guard down. You trusted the warmth in their voice, not knowing it was rehearsed. You answered their calls in the middle of the night, not realizing they were only reaching for you when no one else was available. You gave generously, deeply, sacrificially, only to find out that none of it mattered to them the way it mattered to you. This is what evil looks like when it wants to remain undetected. It smiles. It mimics love. It offers just enough to pull you close and then withholds just enough to make you desperate. You were not blind. You were sincere. You weren't naive, you were hopeful. You weren't foolish, you were faithful. But to someone like them, sincerity is weakness, hope is leverage, and faithfulness is a string to be pulled. They never loved you, not the real you. They loved your devotion. They loved how easily you forgave, how fiercely you believed, how deeply you stayed. They wore love like a costume, not because they were confused about how they felt, but because they knew the costume worked. They knew it was the easiest way into your heart, and once inside, they began to rearrange things. Your sense of worth, your ability to trust, your view of love itself. And the worst part? They walked away as if you were the problem. As if your expectations were too high, as if your emotions were too much, as if your love was somehow suffocating, when in reality they had no capacity to receive the very thing they pretended to offer. But God saw that. He saw the costume fall to the floor the moment you turned your back. He saw the mask drop when no one else was watching. He saw the real heart behind the false love, and he recorded every moment. What they concealed from the world, they could not conceal from the one who sees in secret. And though they left you feeling discarded and deceived, heaven holds a different view. You weren't played because you were weak. You were played because you were pure. And purity, to the wicked, is both unfamiliar and threatening. So they did what cowards do when faced with something sacred. They mocked it, they tested it, and then they tried to break it. But not everything that breaks stays broken. God saw how they twisted your kindness into their control. Kindness is a language of the soul, a sacred gift offered not from obligation but from the overflow of the heart. You didn't just act kind, you are kind. It's in your nature to be gentle with others, to offer help before it's asked, to listen deeply, to care instinctively. Your kindness wasn't a tactic, it wasn't an act, it was truth, it was integrity, it was beauty in its purest form. But to someone who thrives on power, your kindness became an opportunity, a loophole in your armor, a tool to be used. They recognized that you would never retaliate, that you would always give them the benefit of the doubt, that you would blame yourself before accusing them. So they began to twist what was sacred in you into something they could exploit. They turned your generosity into obligation, your patience into permission, your forgiveness into an excuse, and every time you gave them another chance, they grew bolder in their manipulation. They learned how to frame their cruelty as honesty, how to justify their indifference as boundaries, and how to mask their guilt behind silence. And you kept loving. You kept showing up. You kept thinking that maybe, just maybe, if you were kind enough, they would finally see the value of what they were holding. But God saw what they were doing. He saw that your acts of compassion were being weaponized against you, that every extension of grace was being used as a license for further hurt, that they weren't misunderstanding you, they were mastering how to maneuver you. It wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. And while the world might praise cleverness, heaven calls it something else entirely: wickedness. There is a cruelty in this world that hides beneath charm. It cloaks itself in polite words and half smiles. But God sees beyond appearances. He searches the heart. And what he saw in yours was something rare, a goodness unbent by bitterness. And what he saw in theirs was something dangerous, a hunger for control, masked by counterfeit affection. They used your empathy as a leash. They relied on your compassion to silence your boundaries. And when you finally began to pull away, to reclaim your voice, to guard your soul, they said you changed. They called you the cold one, the selfish one, the one who forgot love. But God knows the truth. He knows you held on longer than you should have. He knows you fought for them long after they stopped fighting for you. He knows you swallowed your hurt just to keep peace. And he knows that every time they gained control, it wasn't because you were weak. It was because you were too kind to let go. But now God is stepping in, not to punish you for your softness, but to vindicate it. To declare before heaven and earth that your kindness was never a weakness. It was a mirror that exposed their true face. And soon the games they played with your grace will be the very stage on which God writes your restoration. You weren't weak. They preyed on your sincerity. One of the greatest lies whispered into the hearts of those who have been used is this: you were weak, that's why they did it. But that is not the truth. You were not weak, you were sincere. And there is a vast difference between the two. Weakness is the absence of strength. Sincerity is the fullness of it. It takes real strength to love in a world that constantly rewards manipulation. It takes courage to believe in the good in people, even after you've been let down. And it takes the deepest form of integrity to keep showing up as your true self when others are hiding behind masks. They didn't target you because you were easy to deceive. They targeted you because your sincerity made them feel exposed. Your honesty revealed their duplicity. Your steadiness made their games seem small. And so, like cowards who can't stand to be seen, they chose to diminish what they could not match. You were light, and rather than grow toward it, they tried to dim it. There is something sacred about a soul that doesn't pretend. You didn't wear layers. You didn't calculate your every word. You didn't offer fake apologies or rehearse false affection. What you gave completely. And it's exactly that sincerity that made you their target. Because in a world where everyone is trying to outmaneuver each other, the presence of someone who is real is deeply unsettling. They don't know how to respond to truth, so they choose to abuse it. You gave them access to the deepest parts of you, not carelessly, but wholeheartedly. You believed that love meant vulnerability, that trust meant openness, that honesty should be met with the same, and for a time you even convinced yourself that they felt the same way. But behind the surface, they were calculating. Not just your words, but your reactions. Not just your presence, but your patterns. They watched closely, not to understand, but to control. Not to connect, but to conquer. And when you began to hurt, when your spirit felt the sting of being played, they told you it was your fault, that you were too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. But those were never your crimes. Those were your gifts. They were the very qualities that made you human, the qualities that made you lovable in the first place. They just didn't know how to love something they couldn't dominate. But God knows. He sees how your sincerity was treated like a flaw. He saw how your truth was dismissed, how your tears were mocked, how your hope was taken advantage of, and He is not silent. For every moment they made you feel like your heart was too much, God affirms that your heart was exactly right. For every time they twisted your authenticity into a liability, heaven remembers it as a strength. Your soul was never the problem, their game was. You were preyed upon not because you were lesser, but because you were more open, more honest, more present. And rather than rise to meet that standard, they chose the easier path, exploitation. But what is easy for man is not easy before God. And what they used against you will become the very thing God uses to lift you. Because sincerity may bleed in a world that rewards deceit, but it never bleeds in vain. Their silence was a weapon, but God heard everything. Silence, when it is holy, can be a place of healing, a sacred pause, a space where the soul breathes and the spirit listens. But the silence they gave you was not born of peace. It was born of cruelty. It wasn't the kind of silence that calms. It was the kind that kills slowly. It was calculated, cold, a method of punishment disguised as distance. They knew exactly what their silence would do to you, and they used it anyway. They knew your mind would race with questions, that your heart would beg for answers, that your spirit would twist in knots trying to make sense of the void, and still, they said nothing. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew silence would hurt you more than words ever could. It was never a lack of communication. It was a loud declaration of control. Each unanswered message, each ignored call, each moment of ghosting, it was all a tactic, a way to train you, to teach you that your feelings were disposable, your needs were annoying, and your voice was not worth a reply. And the longer the silence dragged on, the more you blamed yourself. You tried harder. You lowered your expectations. You accepted less and called it love. You stayed silent too, hoping that if you just waited, if you just proved your patience, they would finally come back and speak again. But God was listening while they were silent. He heard the cries you never voiced. He saw the storm inside you when your screen stayed dark, when your inbox stayed empty, when your days were filled with unanswered hopes. He witnessed the dialogue happening in your soul, the pleading, the bargaining, the confusion. And while they said nothing, heaven was taking notes. Because God doesn't just count the words people say, He measures the words they withhold. He weighs the silence. He judges the intent behind quiet cruelty. And in that silence, He saw their power play for what it was, a method of emotional starvation. They didn't leave because they needed space. They left because they wanted control. They wanted you to chase. They wanted you to break. But even in that silence, God was with you. While you stared at the phone, while you waited for the door to open, while you checked your notifications hoping for a single word, He was near. And He was not silent. He was speaking to your spirit, quietly telling you that this was not love, that love does not ignore, that love does not use absence as punishment, that love shows up, speaks up, stays. Their silence was meant to crush you, but it only revealed the depth of your soul. It proved that you were not afraid to feel, that you were still willing to hope, that you were still anchored in connection even when abandoned, and now that silence they used like a blade will return to them like an echo, loud and unrelenting, because God heard everything. Manipulation may fool people, but not the Creator. There is a cleverness in this world that masquerades as wisdom. It wears the garments of success, charisma, and control. It persuades others with carefully chosen words, calculated pauses, and well-timed gestures. But at its core, it is manipulation. A strategy built not on truth, but on illusion. And while many may be fooled by it, heaven never is. You saw how skillfully they crafted their image, how they always seemed just broken enough to earn your compassion, but never truly vulnerable, how they gave you fragments of truth to earn your trust, only to twist it later into leverage. They knew the right tone to speak in when apologizing, the right tears to cry when caught, the perfect excuses to offer when their games became too obvious. It was all a performance, a web spun in silence, drawing you closer while keeping you entangled. And you, being the pure-hearted one, wanted so desperately to believe them. You clung to every glimpse of goodness, hoping it was real. You questioned your own instincts when their words didn't match their actions because they made doubt seem like disloyalty. You gave them the benefit of the doubt again and again, not realizing that their manipulation was intentional, not accidental. They weren't confused, they were calculated. They had rehearsed how to disarm you, how to appear remorseful without ever repenting, how to shift blame so you carried the guilt, how to flip the narrative until you were apologizing for being hurt. They used charm as a weapon and played the victim to distract from the harm they caused. And while others may have admired their confidence, God saw only deceit, because no matter how clever the lie, it is still a lie before the throne of truth. What you experienced wasn't just betrayal, it was gaslighting. They fed you falsehoods so consistently that you began to distrust your own perception of reality. They rewrote the past, distorted your words, and made you feel as though your pain was imaginary, and in doing so, they didn't just wound your heart, they tried to steal your sense of self. But God never bought their performance. He saw past the rehearsed apologies, past the tears shed for appearances, past the perfect mask they wore in front of others. He saw the intentions behind the actions, the manipulation behind the charm, and the control behind the kindness. While others were applauding their exterior, God was examining their heart, and He found it lacking. Manipulation may buy someone time, applause, even relationships, but it cannot buy redemption. It cannot secure favor. It cannot deceive the all-seeing eyes of God. And while the world may be slow to recognize the damage manipulation causes, heaven responds swiftly and with justice, because the one who created truth cannot be fooled by those who twist it. You may feel like you lost because they convinced everyone else they were the victim, but you didn't lose. You simply stepped out of the illusion. You were never in a fair fight. They came with a script, while you came with sincerity. But in the end, truth is not determined by perception. It is determined by God, and what He knows cannot be overturned. Your tears planted the seeds of divine restoration. Pain has a voice. It speaks in silence, in trembling hands, in the ache that lingers even when the world tells you to move on. But your tears were not wasted. They were not weakness. They were seeds. Every drop that fell from your eyes carried your honesty, your heartbreak, and your hope, and heaven took notice. You cried not because you were fragile, but because you were faithful. You believed in love. You trusted it would be returned. You stood in the ruins of broken promises, still trying to rebuild what they had carelessly destroyed. Your tears were not a sign that you gave too much. They were a testament that you were brave enough to feel everything fully, that in a world of numbness and detachment, you still had the courage to care. And while they may have walked away unmoved, God was moved. He doesn't ignore broken hearts. He collects tears. He stores them not as reminders of your sorrow, but as seeds for the restoration He's already preparing. Because in God's economy, nothing is wasted, not even weeping. Every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every cry you made in the dark became soil for something sacred. You may not see the fruit yet, but it is growing. Quietly, powerfully, surely. They may have thought they won because they didn't see you rise right away, but healing doesn't look like revenge. It looks like God planting gardens in the ashes. It looks like strength blooming where there was once only pain. It looks like you becoming whole, not by pretending it didn't happen, but by allowing God to rewrite the ending. Tears have a language that heaven understands. When you didn't know what to pray, your tears spoke for you. When you had no words left, your spirit cried out in grief, and God answered not with explanations, but with preparation. Preparation for renewal, for restoration, for redemption. Those who hurt you saw only the surface. They saw the tears and thought you were drowning. But God saw the deeper layers. He saw that those tears were purifying you, washing away attachments to what was never real, cleansing your heart so He could fill it with what's true. They tried to break you, but all they did was plant you, and buried things grow. So cry if you must. Mourn what was lost. But know this, your tears are not falling into emptiness. They are falling into the hands of the one who specializes in resurrection, into soil that only heaven can water, into the quiet work of a God who turns sorrow into strength and mourning into movement. Every tear you cried was noticed, and not a single one will return void. They played with your heart, but now God writes your redemption. They saw your heart as a game board, a place to play, to manipulate, to conquer. They didn't approach your emotions with reverence. They approached them with tactics. Every confession you made, they used as ammunition. Every vulnerability you shared, they stored for later leverage. It wasn't a relationship to them. It was a competition. One where they needed to feel powerful, needed to stay in control, needed to make you dependent on their inconsistency. They made love into a riddle. One moment warm affection, the next icy withdrawal. One day overflowing promises, the next deafening silence. You never knew where you stood, because that's exactly how they wanted it. It kept you reaching, kept you guessing, kept you working harder for the crumbs they handed you like favors. And all the while, they acted like you were the unstable one, like you were too emotional, like you were the one who needed to calm down and be less intense. But what they were really doing was trying to make you forget your own worth. They thought if they moved the pieces fast enough, you wouldn't notice the pattern. That if they shifted blame convincingly enough, you wouldn't see the control. That if they played long enough, you'd break so completely that you'd never rise again. But they underestimated one thing. God never gave them the pen. They played with your heart, but they were never the author of your story. And now the author steps in. When God writes redemption, He doesn't simply return what was taken, He multiplies it. He restores not just what was lost, but what was damaged. The parts of you that were buried in confusion, shattered by betrayal, drowned in overthinking. He's recovering all of it, slowly, carefully, completely, and He's writing in ink that cannot be erased. You thought you had reached the end of the story. You thought the damage they caused was permanent. But God doesn't end a story with brokenness. He begins with it. What they broke, He builds. What they mocked, He honors. What they misused, He reclaims for His glory. They may have written painful chapters, yes, but they don't get the final word. Their manipulation doesn't get the last line. Their betrayal doesn't write your identity. God does, and He writes from a place of absolute truth. He writes with mercy, with justice, with restoration. His redemptive power does not merely undo what was done, it creates something even greater out of what was left behind. And the most beautiful part? Your story is not one of bitterness, but of brilliance. Not of defeat, but of destiny. Because you chose love in a world of games. You chose grace in the face of cruelty. You chose truth when it would have been easier to numb yourself. That choice, your integrity, was not in vain. It was the seed God needed to begin writing a better ending. They don't know it yet, but they played themselves, because in using you, they elevated you. In breaking you, they handed God the canvas for a masterpiece. In mocking you, they gave Him the opportunity to make you unshakable. They think they won, but the real victory is the fact that you survived without becoming like them. He wrote deception, but now God writes deliverance. There is no game so clever, no silence so calculated, and no manipulation so hidden that God does not see it. While they played with your heart as if it were a toy, God was watching. Not passively, not indifferently, but with the eyes of a loving Father who does not let injustice go unanswered. They may have fooled others, they may have even fooled themselves, but they never fooled God. He saw the games, He counted the tears, He marked the nights you begged for answers and received none, and now He is moving. Not because you begged Him to punish them, but because He honors the sacredness of your heart, because He values what they devalued, because He restores what they wrecked. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not forgotten. You are not foolish for having loved. You were targeted because you carry light, because your heart is deep, because your love was never a game. And now, God will honor that. He will take everything they did in secret and use it to build something eternal in you. Peace, strength, wisdom, and healing that no one can take away. So lift your head. This isn't your ending. This is the turning of the page. And this time, God is holding the pen.